Is July 30th, 2013. My name is David Quick. I'm interviewing Alex Matthews here at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. This is an interview for the D.C. Gardners Oral History Project, which is a project of the Neighborhood Farm Initiative and the D.C. Humanities Council. Alex, thank you for sitting and talking with me today.
You're quite welcome. Alex,
could I start by just having you say your name and your address?
I'm Alexander Matthews. There is an "ander" on it. I live at 1327 Monroe Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C., 20017.
Thank you. Alex, we're going to talk about gardening and growing food here in D.C., but before we get into that, could you just talk a little bit about your early life, where you grew up, your family, neighborhood, things like that?
I grew up in New York City in the borough of Queens, in a place called Astoria, which is actually has in close proximity to Manhattan. Despite that, I grew up in a three-story, probably Victorian-era townhouse attached to the next house, and we had a backyard, and with a huge apple tree. My grandmother loved growing. My grandmother had been born in Italy, and she came here when she was a 12-year-old, and she had a garden in her backyard as long as I could remember. There's a point at which she had other people doing the digging and so on. She hired somebody to dig it up for her. But she grew the garden, and she had quite a variety of things in the garden. She had a fig tree, as I remember, which in the winter she'd cut back, cover with blankets, and top off with a pail, because the winters were much harsher in New York in those days than they are even today, and so it protected the tree from dying. Because I did have a tree die here in the early 90s. It died back to the ground, actually, a fig tree, simply because of the cold. We had a freaky cold winter. I think in like 93 or something.
But your grandmother was growing all that stuff in the house that you also lived in?
Yes.
As a young person?
We had an apartment on the top floor of that house.
Okay.
And my grandmother, she lived on the bottom floor, and she even had chickens once. In New York City.
Was that something she had done in Italy as a young person? I mean,
probably she was used to it. But in Italy, that family had come from farms. So they were way suburban Palermo. So they had farms. They did have livestock and so on. But she grew a lot of tomatoes because we, being Italian, she used a lot of tomatoes. And I had very fond memories of her putting up those tomatoes in jars, canning them, and then having them sit on the shelves and look so inviting.
Beautiful, did you help her with that?
No. The crazy thing is, it's very interesting. I watched I helped her eat the food. Which was always I didn't realize that my grandmother was producing gourmet food, but she was. It was always absolutely wonderful. But I didn't. I wanted to be in the street. I didn't care about staying at home. My dad and I didn't get along well, so we butted heads a lot. So the more I was out of the house, the better it was.
And she didn't push it on you. She didn't.
Never. She didn't. In fact, I think she would have looked at it as an annoyance for me to get involved with her gardening.
I see.
Because she didn't understand. Well, I didn't show any proclivities for it in those days. Interesting. Her husband loved opera, but for him, opera was a folk music. Let's face it. He wasn't coming at it from any highfalutin point of view. And because of my exposure to opera with him, although I hated it as a child, I'm a huge opera fanatic now. And my grandmother would be very pleased to see that I was gardening the way I am now.
Do you have memories of what types of tomatoes and things she grew?
Well, it was going to be mainly plum tomatoes. Plum
Yeah.
tomatoes are great tomatoes for cooking.
Yeah.
So she did a lot of plum tomatoes, but she did other types as well for salads. And stuff.
Yeah. And do you have memories of where you bought food in the city in those days?
Of course.
Yeah.
New York is a paradise for food. And within 2 blocks, we had umpteen grocery stands. Yeah, we did have a supermarket, but people went to grocery stands in those days, and people went to little shops and delicatessens.
Yeah.
We had a kosher delicatessen nearby, where I get Franks with mustard and sauerkraut. I have such wonderful, vivid memories of that. We had a bakery called Walken's Bakery, about a half a block from my house.
Yeah.
Ever hear of Christopher Walken?
Sure.
His dad.
Okay. Okay.
His dad, and he had 3 sons who were all in showbiz. They were showbiz parents, is what they were.
Okay.
And then we had a German bakery up the street. If you got tired of that, and so on and so forth, pizzerias and such a conglomeration and mix of stuff.
Right. Was there any sense of kind of knowing where the food came from that you bought? I ask that because that's a thing that people are talking about a lot now.
Only
but
insofar as my grandmother was growing food in the backyard.
Yeah.
But in those days, you weren't really aware of its nutritional value. You weren't aware of its of how important it was not to have pesticides and so on and so forth. You know, organic methods and so on. She used organic methods.
Yeah.
But only by default. She didn't really go out and research anything.
Right. And we'll jump ahead a bit. Do you put up tomatoes now? Do you do it yourself?
I do.
You do.
Although I used to put up stuff, now I've got a standing freezer.
Okay.
So I tend to freeze a lot.
You freeze a lot more. All right. Well, that's a big change. So, at what point, going to high school, college, what happened as you became a young adult? Did you stay in New York?
I stayed in New York as a very young adult. I quit high school, and my father and I were at such loggerheads that I quit high school. And because I needed to get a job so I could stop living with them. And I was 16 when I quit high school. Although I only moved downstairs 1 floor into my grandmother's rented rooms. And I knocked around New York doing stupid jobs. But I'm of an age where I was going to be drafted.
So what year was this?
This was in the early 60s.
Okay.
I was going to be drafted, and so I had to make a decision. I knew I did not want to go into the Army because I just didn't like what I'd heard about the Army.
Yeah.
And I knew that the Air Force would give me opportunities to travel.
Yeah.
And I thought that it would also be very good from an educational point of view. And so I chose the Air Force. It meant 2 more years,
Right.
4 instead of 2 years. And I went to the Air Force. I was stationed immediately in Turkey, and then I was transferred to Germany, and then back to Turkey.
Okay.
And so my entire time was spent abroad, practically.
Yeah. And this was, you were 18, 17,
No. I had knocked around New York a few years. I was 22 when I went to the service. And when I was in Turkey, I met a woman who, there were some lifestyle changes that I was seeking to do. Because my life in New York had been fun, but frivolous.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of get away from frivolity.
Yeah.
And so I thought, if I'm away from New York and all those old friends and so on, I met this woman and we ended up married.
A Turkish woman or
a Turkish woman?
Okay.
She was a Turkish woman who had been here to school. She had practically a master's degree from Boston University in philosophy of all things. we ended up getting married while I was over there.
And were you an officer or enlisted?
I was enlisted.
Okay.
No, I could not have been an officer
right.
without even a high school
Right,
degree.
right.
Of course, the minute I got to Turkey, I immediately set about getting the GED. And then I started University of Maryland offers courses in Turkey and Germany, throughout the world, actually.
Yeah.
And I started to take those courses. And because she was a real, I met her fairly early on, and she was a real instigator, and she was trying to push me in that direction. She said,
Yeah.
you know, I know that you can do this.
Yeah.
So, because I had never had that from my family. My family's a working class family. So I started to take courses. When I came back, I was married at that time. I applied to the University of Maryland because I had taken courses there, and they accepted me with a couple of remedial courses.
Yeah.
I ended up graduating with honors from the University of Maryland.
Nice.
So,
What did you study? What did you study?
History. She and I, however, parted as husband and wife. We've never parted as friends. We see each other a lot. We have many friends in common.
Yeah.
I'm like an uncle to her children, with her current husband. Her children at this point are having children of their own.
Yeah.
And it's so she's kind of an extension of my family, and it has been a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
But I went about sort of creating families of my own.
Yeah. During those times, early years going into Turkey, had you started gardening yet at all?
Not really, except that my mother-in-law had a gorgeous garden, but her garden was much more. My parents-in-law were well off.
Yeah.
And they had gardens for show, gorgeous roses and flowers.
In Turkey or here?
In Turkey.
Okay.
At their beach house.
I see.
And so they of course they had somebody to maintain that for them. But that's where I became very aware of beautiful roses and so on and so forth. Although as a kid going through Astoria, I was so drawn to tulips and things. I would sometimes pick them from people's yards. I was young though.
Yeah.
But I became aware. Then when I came back and went to the University of Maryland, and after she and I broke up, I became much more interested in gardening. The counterculture had hit.
Yeah.
People were talking about some of the values that we have today in terms of gardening, in terms of not using pesticides and so on.
Okay.
And I began to move in that direction. I was living in an apartment at Hyattsville. Okay. One of those 3-story brick town, kind of, not townhouses, the kinds of apartment buildings they built for returning soldiers after the Second World War. And I decided I was going to put a garden out in front of the building. And I did. Went to the stables up in Rock Creek Park and got manure.
Yeah.
Went to Giant and asked them for their fish offal. And they said, well, you have to go to the trash pail to pick it. We can't give it to you over the counter. So I went to the trash pail and picked fish offal.
For as a fertilizer.
As fertilizer.
Yeah.
And the Indians had done it. Why couldn't I? And so my poor neighbors downstairs, though, had to deal with the fish offal stuck in the manure and the smells that created. But we had wonderful garden going. And then I had other friends who had gardens as well. And this whole thing kind of mushroomed and ballooned. When I was looking for a house with a partner, that was in 1977. Yeah. One of my criteria was there has to be a garden. And in fact, there was. I had to have a fireplace too, and the fireplace has turned out to be a great thing because I use the ash from the fireplace. Yeah. For the garden. Everything gets recycled at this point. And I have a very sizable garden. I have my property is 50 by 150, and my house is on the first third of it. So I have about 90 feet in the back of the house. Yeah. by 50 feet wide, and I use perhaps a third of that as a vegetable garden.
Nice.
Yeah, very nice.
Back when you started that garden at that apartment building, what was your... it sounds like that you hadn't actually done that yet on your own time. No. What was your knowledge base? I mean, you knew where to find manure and fish, offal, and things like that.
I'm a very resourceful person. I can find things.
And but how did you even know?
I probably was reading.
Okay.
I was probably reading stuff like Department of Agriculture books and stuff like that. Little pamphlets.
Yeah.
Not really heavy-duty reading. Not the books I would later get. Although I'm not that bookish, really. I'll look at stuff. For instance, I remember looking at the composition of compost. How does one do composting? What kinds of materials should you use? What should you avoid? That kind of thing. And so early on, I developed a sense of that, and haven't had to go back to the books for it.
Okay, so you just...
It's there. It's here.
Wisdom that you absorbed. And what kind of work were you doing at that point, just professionally?
When I moved to that house,
I
was working at the Library of Congress.
Okay.
In an administrative job. I was in the personnel office, and I was the supervisor of the personnel office.
And going back even a little bit, when you were traveling in the Air Force, it's always interesting to be in other countries and see food and experience food there. Do you have any memories of connecting with food or growing food in those places?
No question. The Turks produce the most absolutely delicious foods, and probably with very little pesticide, or if any at all. And really quite amazing. They're very proud of their food. Now, that was then. I don't know what's happened since.
Yeah.
But I do remember developing a love affair with food and developing a sense of what gourmet food is.
Okay. So that bloomed in Turkey specifically?
I would say it probably... Well, the fact is, I was being subjected to it as a child by my grandmother's cooking.
Yeah.
And so I was eating it without realizing that I was eating well. But then once I got to Turkey, I began to really think about it in a way that I hadn't thought about it previously. But then I began to think about a lot of things in a way that I hadn't.
Yeah. And did you learn how to cook at that point? Did you start to cook yourself?
Yes, I started to cook myself, and I developed a specialty for baking bread, which I baked bread 2 days ago.
Yeah,
I bake bread all the time. I don't ever buy bread. I bake bread. And if I'm invited for dinner, sometimes it's because they expect me to bring bread.
Yeah. Do they let you in? Do they just put a hand out the door?
But I not only did bread, I did a lot of things. I was living with somebody, so it was great because I was cooking for two, not one. Cooking for one, you don't want to go whole hog. It's just too much trouble.
Yeah.
But cooking for two, although I do cook for myself, I must say that. But I in those days I was doing crazy stuff. I was making profiterole and all kinds of and even trying to do flaky pastry and all kinds of stuff like that.
This was once you were here in Washington and single again.
And this was in a small kitchen in Hyattsville. My kitchen now is not a small kitchen.
Yeah. And so you started that garden at your apartment. How did your building mates take to the garden?
I'm surprised that they weren't up one side and down the other, but they let me go. They cut me some slack on that. But because I think if I had smelt that stuff out my window, I would have been really upset.
Yeah.
But
and did they care that they no longer had a lawn? I mean,
well, it was just a green space, maybe 4 feet deep, for the length of one side of the building.
Okay.
Because then there was a concrete wall after that.
Yeah.
So
Did any of them join you in gardening?
Nobody was interested.
Okay. Earlier you referred to that as a time when the counterculture was coming into its own and kind of
Hair.
things hair and
Ridiculous clothing.
That, the social aspects, but also the people thinking about where food comes from and how it's grown. What do you remember going on in the DC area around that? I mean, people kind of, who was doing that?
I don't remember anything area-wide. I remember in my particular group, we had a number of friends who were engaged in trying to do some gardening if they had space to do gardening, and if they had time. My friends, a lot of my friends were teachers. They were all in professional positions, so it's and they were essentially starting out in life. So they were, busy with other things. They couldn't. But in terms of food, I'm just remembering. In '72, I met the person who I bought the house with, and he introduced me to a whole bunch of his friends. One of those friends was the legislative aide to Mike Mansfield, who was the majority leader in the Senate for 20 years.
Yeah.
And this friend, his name was Ray Dockstader. His food was as good as any restaurant in the city. When you got invited to his place, you knew you were going to eat fabulously.
Yeah.
Fabulously. And he never disappointed. Really amazing. Later on, after Mike Mansfield left and became our ambassador to Japan, he made sure that his staff all got jobs, and Ray went to work at the Library of Congress as the assistant director of the American Folk Life Division.
Oh. That's where I worked before my current job.
Really?
In the Veterans History Project, which is an oral history project of veterans.
I even thought about jumping in on that too, because I'm a veteran.
Yeah, well, I could make that happen if you wanted to.
But Ray, I don't know. You were there considerably after him, because I think
probably,
Ray probably retired in the 90s, somewhere in the 90s.
Okay.
But if you ask any of those people, they'd know who he was.
Sure. Was he a gardener?
He was a pot gardener. He gardened in pots.
In pots.
But it was always,
he didn't grow pot.
But it wasn't food. It wasn't food.
Oh,
it was usually when he was in a townhouse, he might have grown some food, a little bit, but it wasn't food. It was gorgeous plants, which he when he was living at 701 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is right there with where Market Square is. He was in a penthouse up there. And he had a very large balcony. He had 130-something plants on the balcony. Moving him was no fun.
Moving plants is hard, yeah. All right, so you moved from Hyattsville to Brooklands in the house you live in.
78.
Yeah.
And I still live in that house.
That's where you still
live. I've been there for 35 years.
And what was Brookland like then? It's changed a lot very recently, but
well, the real change is that a lot of middle class and especially white people are moving in. But there are also middle class black people moving in as well.
At that time. Now, yeah.
But the fact is, a lot of people don't realize much of Brookland, not all, but much of Brookland was in fact middle class black. These folks had been confined to this neighborhood from the 50s, let's say 40s, 50s, because they weren't able to get in to Chevy Chase and so on. So although they might have had jobs and wealth enough to do that, they were covenants and they weren't welcome. And so this was an area where we've had lots of Howard faculty lived here at the time. Who else? People in mid-level and even in higher level positions people, lawyers and doctors and so on,
Yeah.
lived throughout the neighborhood. Some of the housing stock began to go down because when I moved here, this was a geriatric neighborhood. I was a young person in this neighborhood.
Why did you move to Brookland?
Because I love the house. I fell in love with the house. The house is a great house. The house is crumbling down around my ears, but it's a great house.
It was probably affordable for DC.
It was eminently affordable. We were looking in Mount Pleasant, Capitol Hill, and Brookland. And Brookland was considerably less expensive than the other two. And we got much more for the money.
Yeah.
And I, to be quite honest, I was very trepidatious about being broken into that kind of thing. I've been very fortunate, thankfully. There have been attempts, but nobody's ever actually gotten into the house. And I know my neighbor across the street. I've known her since I moved there, and she's been there for well in excess of 50 years now. There are a couple of neighbors down the street who were there even longer than she. They're both dead now, but this is a place where people stay and get to know each other and get to like each other.
Yeah,
and we care about each other.
I agree. So you moved into the house, and you described the amount of space that you started cultivating. Was that something you dove into immediately?
The very first summer I was there in '78, I was in that garden and working it, and I knew that the soil needed amendation. That there was no question of that. And so I began to go. I was
based
going
on what? Just feeling it and seeing it.
Well, no, a lot of it was lawn. A lot of it was lawn. It wasn't under cultivation. There were shrubs, helter-skelter here and there, with no particular aesthetic sense.
Yeah.
I removed them. I moved things around. I created a garden, basically. But I also created a backyard. I created a berm. I managed to find stones, and there was a place in Georgetown where a building had been taken down with large granite stones, and I was going there on a regular basis and just loading up the granite stones, and I created this berm with all those granite stones. And the berm kind of defines a little sitting area, and then behind that is where my garden is.
Okay. So how did you amend the soil?
At the University of Maryland, in those days they had horses, they had cows, they had chickens. And I went out there and got a lot of manure, and used that. And then, of course, I began to do the reading, and I knew that leaves were a good source, especially oak leaves, a good thing for compost. Table scraps. Of course, the table scraps should never have meat. I knew that.
So did you have your own compost pile going? Or?
Yes, I do. I still do. Very same compost pile. Grass. Just lots of. In fact, just as I was leaving the house a few minutes ago, my neighbor was putting his grass out and my neighbor died, but his son was putting the grass out. Okay. And I said, Carlos, from now on, just throw it in my backyard. It'll be easier on you, and I can use it. Yeah. He said, okay.
Great. But you just do a pile. You don't have a barrel or anything. Or?
Well, more recently, friends in the neighborhood moved to Duluth, and they left me one of those plastic things that you create a compost with. That it's basically a flat sheet that you make into a round, and you screw it together with these plastic screws.
Yeah.
And you put it right on the ground, and you throw stuff into it.
Yeah.
I guess you could just pull it right up, and then just turn the stuff, and then put it back into it. So I've started one of those as well. And then there are other places where I just throw it up against the fence. I've got a lot of compost going.
That's good. A lot of urban dwellers are afraid of compost.
Well, it's dirty.
It's dirty.
But what I love is the final product. It's this wonderful, rich, black soil that is, it's the stuff you go out and buy at Home Depot for a lot of money.
Right. When you, in those early years living in Brooklyn, did you make connections with other people in the neighborhood who were also gardening? Because at some point you become active in the neighborhood garden group, right?
Yes.
What was going on in those first?
Not in those days.
Yeah.
Not in those days. There were some people, let me think. Some people were doing gardening in their backyards, but even then, my neighbors across the street, Rosie and Donald, they didn't move there until maybe 89, and 88 or 89, and they became very active gardeners in their yard. My neighbors, Lucy and Pat, were gardening in their yard right next door. But next door it's called Mary House, and it's one of those. And they were only there for a certain period of time. So it always depended on who was in the house as to whether that garden would be working or not.
Okay.
But Rosie and Donald became very active, and they along with Jeff Wilson, started the Brooklyn Garden Club, Greater Brooklyn Garden Club. And then Jeff came on the scene somewhere in the mid-'90s, I believe, mid to late '90s. Jeff and Alvin. And Jeff is one of these people who's an organizer.
Yeah.
He organizes people. And so he also pisses people off from time to time. But he does a very good job of organizing. And he got this thing together, and suddenly all of us Brookland gardeners began to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And meet once a month at somebody's home, share a potluck meal, and talk about issues in gardening, or things that might be of interest to us, and see each other's gardens too. And there have been some terrific gardens. We've also gotten into some interesting houses.
Yeah.
Ralph Bunch's house, the guy who owns it, he's not a gardener, but we just wanted to see the house, so we got him to invite us into the house.
What street is that on?
It's on Irving, I think.
Okay.
Irving, around between 15th and 16th, I believe. You could probably find that fairly easily.
But that happened in the 90s, when the group...
the Ralph Bunch thing happened in the 2000s. But,
okay, I mean the 90s, the group coming together.
Late 90s is when I would say we came together, we got to know each other, we got to interact. The great thing is you get to know so many different people in that context. You walk down the street, oh, hi, and so on. Well, Brooklyn was always the nice thing. When I said I moved to Brooklyn in 78, what I liked about Brooklyn was you didn't walk past a person on the street who didn't greet you. Unless they were a surly 14-year-old or something like that. Everybody greeted you.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen anymore. And that especially doesn't happen with the people who've moved here from DuPont Circle and other parts of town where they're just not used to being neighborly.
Yeah.
Or they're afraid.
Yeah.
There was a man who was coming back from buying pizza, and I said hello. He ignored me totally. I screamed hello, and he jumped out into the street as though I were going to attack him.
This was recently?
Huh?
This was recently?
This was within the last year. What is up with these people?
I don't know. So it sounds like even when you just became a confident gardener and kind of on your own.
I did, but I'm also not. I'm not. How can I put it? By the book gardener. I'm not going to. But there are some people that research the dickens out of things.
Yeah.
They just research them to the nth degree, and then of course they all talk about the finer points of this or the finer points of that. My feeling is get the plant if you're going to get it that's already grown at, wherever it is, Home Depot or whatever, or from organic gardens. There is a wonderful. I have to turn you on to this woman, Lori.
Yeah.
You know Lori?
I do. I'm going to interview her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You're going to interview her?
Yep.
Yeah. Lori grows. Of course, she won't have anything to do with a beefsteak or a Better Boy. It's got to be Japanese striped something or another.
Yeah.
And she grows the most amazing stuff. and she does it as a service to the community. She sells these little potted plants for $1.50 or something, and then when she's down to a few, she said, "Okay, you can have them for $1."
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And last year I bought a bunch. One of my big problems is my work interferes with spring preparation.
Yeah.
And so last year I threw a lot of her tomatoes on a compost pile.
Because you just didn't get to them in time?
No. What happens is at the end, a certain number of tomatoes are going to be eaten by something, or they're going to rot on the vine, or one thing or another. And because I do a lot of tomatoes. I do, I do 20, 30, 40 plants, maybe 50.
Is that the main thing that
It's
you
the main
grow?
thing.
Yeah.
I do also peppers. And there are other things too. I have, I think I bought from Lori some cabbage last year, and I got some, what else? Oh, a bunch of other stuff. A bunch of others. Some herbs, I think. And so I threw them in the compost pile. They all came up this year. She told me
they volunteered.
They volunteered. And so I separated them out, and they're all producing.
Nice.
So I'm now producing my own. What I have to do is start really collecting the seeds, so I know which particular tomato is going to come up. Because I'm not cherries, the cherry tomatoes. They're like a weed. They reproduce themselves. You can treat that seed harshly, and it will still come up.
Yeah. And it's a good weed to have.
It's a good weed. It's a good. I'm not one to just yank it out the ground. Some people might do that, but I'd much prefer to have something of size.
Yeah. And Lori has lived in Brooklyn for quite a while.
She has.
Was she doing that all along?
I believe so. She was an early member of the Garden Club until Jeff kind of ticked her off a little bit. Jeff is a very strong person, and sometimes he can be a little bit insensitive. He doesn't mean to be, but he can.
Yeah. And who are the other people, like, the Loris or the Jeffs that you remember from?
Oh, there have been so many people. Mary Pat Rowan, she came along at some point and became a member of the club, and she's actually a very active member of the club now. Jeff is withdrawn. He's a member of the club, but he's only a member. He's not president or anything.
Yeah.
For a long time, he was running the meetings and so on, and boring us. But Mary Pat Rowan, Joe, I can't remember Joe's last name, but she and her husband Martin, they live on Kearney. They've been very active, and these are worker bees. These are the people who roll up their sleeves and do a lot of work. Also, they'll do things like collect greens for the sale.
Yeah.
Because we have sales, plant sales and green sales, in order to. By greens, I mean for holly and such for Christmas. To enhance the garden club, to enhance its programs, to help its programs. Because the garden club, when the garden club started, right next to where on Monroe and 12th, northwest corner, next to what is Long and Foster, what was Long and Foster, I think, what is it now? Some kind of a insurance company or something.
Yes,
yeah.
That is.
That was asphalt with a couple of very large dumpsters sitting on it. That's what everybody had to look at every day when they walked past that corner. Jeff had this idea, let's go to the owner of this property and get him to allow us to beautify it. And we did. And we created that garden.
Nice.
The subsequent owner, it was sold, took over management of the garden from us. I think he felt it was just too overgrown or whatever. And it's okay. But it's not like it once was. It really is. It's quite nice. They also did the space outside of Long and Foster on Newton. That little curb, sort of defining their parking area. They did that. We did also the triangle at Michigan and 12th. With the big stones and so on. I mean, we bought those big stones. and paid for the sign and so on.
Interesting.
The city didn't pay for any of that. We did.
Yeah, and I bet a lot of people don't even know that. I didn't.
You didn't know that?
No.
We were very active in that, and we had quite a number of worker bees all over that place. A very nice man, Phil Raitt, who died last year of cancer. Phil Raitt was very active, and he was one of those people who was there digging and weeding and so on. And quite a number of people have been active. Quite a number. So we had those projects.
Yeah.
And that's been very good.
Yeah. You, before we started recording, you mentioned that there was an attempt to have a community garden at one point.
There wasn't an attempt. There was a community garden.
And a successful
And it was on
attempt.
Catholic University property, surrounded by chain link fence. And when I moved here, the lot between 7th and 8th Streets, between Monroe and Lawrence, very large lot, had houses on it. Widely spaced, very nice, very 18th century. Not 18th, I'm sorry, very 19th century houses. Late 19th century houses, maybe early 20th as well. And Catholic University managed to buy them all up, with the exception of about 3 on the Lawrence Street side. And it proceeded at one point to tear them all down and put up a chain link fence. And there it stood for 20 years, 20 plus years, with a chain link fence around that lot.
There was nothing. Clear project that they had.
No. Also, where the Brookland building is now, the one with Brookland written on it,
the very new one.
That had been, when I moved here, a Holiday Inn. It went up. It went belly up. Catholic bought it, turned it into a dormitory until it was totally trashed, and then raised that.
Yeah.
And then put a chain link fence around that property.
And now those.
And there it stood for all that time.
Yeah.
And now there's those two. The Monroe Street Market is going to be there.
Yeah.
It's a total change. It's a total change.
It's very, very different. But there were folks who put in a community garden in one of those spaces.
In the space between 7th and 8th, and between Monroe and Lawrence, right across from. Do you remember Spalding? Were you here when Spalding was taken down? There was a dormitory until about 3 or 4 years ago, right across 7th Street.
Yeah.
From the space I'm talking about, and it was a very large space, very large lot. And Christina Shelton was gardening there. Gail Turner, she's gone from Washington now. Pam, whose last name I'm not remembering, she lives down on Franklin Street. Quite a number were gardening in that space and producing quite nice stuff. They would have people come in and bring in loads of manure and stuff like that, or compost or whatever. More mulch than anything else. And they were doing a lovely job. Really nice job. But unfortunately, there was a little locking of horns from time to time between them. And this person would drop out or that person would drop out. They were getting water from a neighbor and having to pay for it, of course. But at one point, Catholic decided, I think Catholic was probably thinking in terms of this project, we're going to try to get something going here.
Right.
And so Catholic decided that they weren't going to allow anybody to continue.
Yeah.
And so that project was 7 to 10 years. Maybe 10 would be too long, but 7 would be about right.
And then they got the boot.
And then they got the boot.
Okay. But it's interesting in interviewing these people, hearing about the community gardens, particularly the ones that don't exist anymore, because there's good stories.
So
there.
Christina Shelton, who was a gardener there, she went up to North Capitol Street, north of Riggs, even north of New Hampshire. Just after New Hampshire, there's a large garden plot there.
Yeah.
And she went up there. Although she has a yard here, but I don't think her yard is sufficient.
Yeah. What else? I mean, you've lived in D.C. and Brookland for over 30 years now. What's different now? People talk about food and where it comes from a lot now. What's your impression of the food scene now in D.C.?
One of the things that worries me, I'm plugged in politically on everything, on all politics. But the discussion of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. That's right, yeah. GMOs. I'm very concerned about that. I was using a lot of soy milk. I've stopped using soy milk because of that. Because I think all GMO, all soy milk is genetically modified. It just seems to me that we should have the option of knowing what we're eating, and those things should be labeled. And it's just as somebody said, it would be like putting a skull and crossbones on something. If that might be the case, I don't care. I want to know.
Yeah.
So I think that we've all become much more aware of foods and of what's in foods, and what we're willing to chance and what we're willing to avoid, or what we seek to avoid. I think we're all better consumers in that respect. I don't think our government is doing a good job to advocate for the people. They're doing a much better job to advocate for business.
Yeah. Do you think that, you talk about the Brookland Garden Club and you talk about the overall change in kind of neighborliness in Brooklands. Do you think does that give people the connections they need to advocate for the food and know where it comes from? Are they...
Well, if we haven't discussed it, I don't remember us ever discussing dangers with foods, dangers with genetically modified things or pesticides or whatever. I think that most of us are pesticide free. Most of us won't do it.
Yeah.
So we're all running organic gardens, but now there are organic gardens, and then there are organic gardens. For instance, there's a young woman who's just moved into Chancellor's Row, and she advertised on the list saying, I do occasional catering, and I have the stuff that would be great for a compost pile, but I can't do a compost pile where I live. If you'd like it, you're welcome to it. And I immediately said I'd love it.
Yeah. And
then she started asking me questions. She said, "Well, I don't know if these eggs are organic," and eggshells. I don't care if they're organic or not. That's. And so she wouldn't vouch for. She said, "I can't vouch for whether this is organic or this is." Some people go a little bit off the deep end on some of this stuff.
But they might not know also. Just kind of having, after you do it for a long time, you just get a sense of the cycle of
some
it.
People,
and if you don't do it, you don't know that.
But some people, they're just afraid of using the wrong thing because that might, in the long run, hurt them.
Yeah.
In the long run, I could come down with cancer, and it could have been because of something I ate 25 years ago. Who knows? But in the fact, I eat a lot of my own vegetables, and I'm 72 years old. And yesterday morning, I was standing. I'm for my work. I'm a tour guide. I was sitting online at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing at 6 a.m. And that was the first group, and I was with that group till 4:30, and then I had a group from 8 to 10, and so I wasn't coming home until 10:30 last night. And I'm okay.
You're okay. Yeah.
And then I checked my email after I got it.
Nice. And so you will continue to garden. It sounds like that's
I'll continue to garden as long as my body will allow me to continue to garden. I'll continue to guide as long as my body will continue to guide. That said, I have quite a number of colleagues who are guides who are in their mid to late 80s. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't. They would never admit to that. But we're all sort of figuring.
Who employs you as a guide? Where are you a guide?
Whatever company.
Okay.
We're in touch with a lot of different companies.
Okay.
And we belong to the guild. Many of us belong to the Guild of Professional Tour Guides, and that's how you get your name out, and you get to know other guides. And people call you and say, "Hey, can you do this for me?" and that kind of thing. And then you develop a reputation.
What do you think of the new restaurant in Brooklyn? Are you a restaurant goer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Not outrageously, but I'm not every night or anything. But I've been to Little Ricky's several times, and I've enjoyed it. One of the problems I have with Little Ricky's is the word "little." You get little food. And then the other, I was one time disappointed with crab cakes because they had been breaded and deep fried. And it seems to me that should be on the menu. You should say it's going to be breaded and deep fried so that people can afford it. But I like it otherwise.
Yeah.
It's a nice ambiance. The people are great. The crowds there are fun. And of course, I go on certain nights when a lot of people I know are going to be there and have a good time.
Yeah.
I've been to San Antonio Grill and I like it. I don't go there a whole lot, but I've never been to Meno Male, and I've been meaning to go there. But it's sort of at the other end of Brooklyn.
It is down there at Rhode Island. Nice. Well, is there anything we haven't covered? We're coming up on an hour. What else would you say about being a gardener in the city? What advice would you give?
Well, there is. If you're lucky enough to have a plot of land, gardening does exist in the city. It exists and it gives great satisfaction. There's a lot of hard work with gardening.
Yeah.
However, when all is said and done, and you pick that gorgeous red tomato off the vine and take it in, immediately cut it, and eat it. That's living. There's nothing that compares with that.
Yeah. Nice. Well, Alex, thank you very much for
You are
sitting
very welcome.
and talking
It was
with
my
me
pleasure.
today. Likewise. All right.